Hello, it's Harry Brook here, Ag Fieldman for Flagstaff County, and today we're talking to Dr. Boyd Mori, who is an assistant professor at the U of A and the NSERC Industrial Chair. Now that sounds important. And insects are important too.
You're listening to the official podcast of Flagstaff County.
So today we're going to be talking about, in particular, insects that affect canola. And one of the first ones that come to mind and come whenever canola starts to emerge are flea beetles. Let's talk about those little beggars.
Sounds good. So I think flea beetles, as most people know, are pretty much an annual issue.
Yes,
too bad. You can't buy seed without a seed treatment for flea beetles. So 100% of our canola acreage has a treatment for for flea beetles. Right now, of course, the base package contains a neonicotinoid, and then you can always add on or upgrade with some of our other products, depending on what company you're dealing with. So yeah, every spring they are our annual issue. Depending on the region, some regions we can get such high populations that the seed treatments fail, and then we have to apply an additional insecticide.
I find it interesting, though, that how there's been a population shift, because I'm old enough to remember when crucifer flea beetles were this kind of the problem. They weren't that big a problem because we used to have a greater varied crop rotation. But now with more frequent canola being grown, it seems there's been a real shift to the two-stripe.
Yeah, and Julie Soroka, former research scientist in Saskatoon at Ag Canada in Saskatoon, she did some work over a number of years tracking the flea beetle populations. And it does seem that we've had this kind of shift southward in our striped flea beetle populations. And it could be a result of, climate change, the better growing conditions for the beetles. As well, there's some work that was done in the past, actually out of the U of A with Jim Tansey, who's now a provincial entomologist in Saskatchewan, and Andy Ketty, professor at U of A. They showed that the striped flea beetles are more tolerant of our neonicotinoid seed treatments.
Okay.
Meaning that some of them can survive when feeding on those plants. So that could also be contributing to this shift that we're seeing in populations.
So it's almost like we're selecting for a shift towards the two-stripe, possibly, or it may be a factor, not the only factor, but a factor.
It definitely could be a factor, yes. And actually some work that we've just begun in my lab is following up on that, seeing, what are our current tolerance levels within both flea beetles, within both the crucifer and the stripe, to our neonics, as well as some of the newer products that are being marketed towards flea beetles, both seed treatment and foliar applications. So hopefully in a few years we'll have some more information about that.
Yeah, it's always tricky, when you're looking at economic thresholds. And with flea beetles, they seem to be, it's not a real black and white issue. It tends to be very gray, I find, because you have to also consider not just the amount of damage and the number of flea beetles present, but also weather conditions, growing conditions, plant populations. It's sort of like you get a cold spell. Well, it seems to shift. It's sometimes to do with the actual feeding on the cotyledons, and other times you start getting feeding on the stem or on the growing point, which is far more damaging than just the cotyledon feeding. So I find it's very hard to get around the idea of, okay, where should you spray and when should you spray? And unfortunately, because of the cost of canola, it seems like a lot of guys will default. They see flea beetles and they almost default to a insecticide spray foliar.
Yeah, that is a tough one, especially if you have, dry conditions or, as you mentioned, cold conditions, a slowly emerging crop. As you mentioned, maybe some low plant stand density. It's a numbers game, right? Low plant stand density, you get more flea beetle feeding on the few remaining plants that you have. So, and if the conditions are right, we can go from anywhere from 25% damage to 50% damage in less than a day. So, 25% is the foliar damage is the economic, or pardon me, is the action threshold. 50% is the economic threshold. So, but if you wait after, 25%, you could be too late, a couple of days later. So that's why it's still very much recommended, that 25% action threshold.
So what about not late seeding, but mid-season seeding versus early seeding? Because it seems when you seed it really early and the soils are kind of cool, there's no guarantee it's going to be continuing to warm up in a straight line. We tend to have a lot of variability in our weather, such as this winter. And you get soils. I use the ACIS, the Alberta Climate Information Service, and check the various stations around the province that have the soil monitors for the temperatures. And you can see that top 5 centimeters, it bounces around a heck of a lot before she starts actually on a full-time climb. And what are your comments about maybe not seeding quite so early with the canola?
Yeah, I guess, that's where that's another kind of gray area, right? Because we have variable moisture. Are we trying to get that early season moisture benefit by seeding early? Are we taking a frost risk or two if we seed too early? So, but I think this is something that we talked about off the podcast, is that some farmers, they have so many acres that they need to seed that you can't really delay. They need to get the crop in the ground. So it is really going to be kind of farm specific on when they can. You can kind of think of it, as I said before, like a numbers game. If you have several canola fields in a region or in a little area, all seeded around the same date, or maybe one seeded early and the rest are seeded a little bit later, chances are that early seeded field is going to have just more flea beetle pressure, because more flea beetles are going to find it, right? They see that bit of green and they're going to, it's the first one there. Whereas if you have more acres of canola around you, they're going to spread out. At least that's the hope. And we see a similar thing with cabbage seedpod weevil further south. But I
was wondering, how good a flyer are they? Like, how far will they actually fly looking for feed?
That is a great question. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but they can fly, and they are active flyers. They are tiny, right? So even once they spread out their wings, although it may not be necessarily active flight, they can get pushed quite easily by little breezes and a bit of the wind. So they can move fairly readily and fairly quickly between different areas. So
okay. But like any other insect, they're going to be lazy and go with the wind.
Yeah.
So what is the connection between fall populations of flea beetles and spring populations of flea beetles? Like, do they overwinter as adults?
That's the ultimate question. We get that a lot. So yes, they do overwinter as adults. So that late feeding that you see sometimes on pods late in the summer, that is the overwintering generation. So those adults, once they're done feeding, they will move into kind of shelter belts, ditches, anywhere kind of to get some cover. And then they will basically go into diapause or hibernate over the winter. And so the next year, those will be what are coming out and feeding on the cotyledons first thing in the spring. So, but the connection, like, that's a good question, and it's something that we really wonder about. We see these large populations, especially last year. We saw quite a lot of feeding on the pods.
It was a beautiful fall,
right? Yeah. But we just don't know. Like you pointed out, our weather right now, these yo-yoing weather conditions our frigid polar vortex is that helping to kill off some of these flea beetles? And unfortunately, we just don't have really good information on that. often it's been shown that if you have kind of a good snow cover, and even the top kind of 10 to 15 centimeters of soil doesn't generally drop below minus 10 degrees Celsius.
Right.
And, that a lot of insects, they're cold hardy to well below minus 20 degrees Celsius. And even at that temperature, it could take potentially weeks for many of them to be killed off at those kind of extremes. So the connection with flea beetles, unfortunately, we just don't know it. We don't have a good handle on that.
There's still a lot of unanswered questions, aren't there, with them?
A lot.
Yes. It seems to be a moving target as far as what we need to know. And because there have been years where it's like, oh my God, look at the fall. You've got plants totally coated in flea beetles, and you think, it's going to be a total disaster.
Yeah.
But winter has its upside, one of them being, I guess, if it's cold enough and dry enough, you can kill those little beggars, which absolutely. I'm all in favor of, What about natural predators? Because I'm wondering, we talk about other insect pests, and we know that we do have the predators and that feed on them. And I'm just wondering, are flea beetles immune, or they just got such a hard shell and they're so small, nobody's going to eat that many of them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in terms of specific, they all predators or parasitoids that will only feed on flea beetles, we don't have any. Unfortunately, it would be great if we had, a parasitic wasp or something that would specifically attack flea beetles, but we don't have any. We do know things like some ground beetles and spiders, more of our generalist predators. They will eat flea beetles, but if we have such huge populations of flea beetles, they're not really doing a whole lot in terms of control, unfortunately. Could it be worse if we didn't have them? Absolutely. But in terms of getting, below kind of economic levels of damage just by our current natural enemies, unfortunately, I just don't see that happening. These other insects, they're quite generalists. So they'll feed on a wide variety of things. And, if there's a slug or a caterpillar that's slow moving, why wouldn't it just feed on that buffet rather than trying to track down these little flea beetles that can hop and fly away?
You're telling me they're a bunch of slackers, aren't you?
Exactly.
Mind you, it's conservation of energy. It's go for the easy meal. Those flea beetles, they keep moving around so fast. What a pity. If you were giving someone advice on how to reduce the incidence of having to actually even spray for flea beetles, what would be the changes or even the crop rotations that you'd recommend? Because a lot of our larger producers in the county will have a 2 or 3 crop rotation. And canola being one of the major ones because it pays the best. Yeah.
So right there, a lot of longer crop rotations will definitely help because there's fewer resources for them to feed on. But even cultural controls, and of course, a lot of our fields are very weed free. They're very clean, but flea beetles do have quite a few alternative hosts in that a lot of our, cruciferous weeds can be their hosts early in the season, like early in the spring before canola is planted. Stinkweed, yes, peppergrass, all of those can be their early season hosts. So removing those early in the season can help reduce flea beetle populations. Other than that, we don't have a lot of cultural control. There was some previous work that showed kind of and I'm not recommending this, but it showed that the later weeds were actually sprayed out of a field, there was reduced damage on canola. But these were quite weedy plots. So I think it was up to, around the 6 leaf stage of canola when weeds were finally sprayed.
Whoa, that's getting late.
That's getting very late. So, but things like having higher stubble or planting into a stubble field, which almost all growers are reduce till
Yeah,
or no
right.
till, that definitely does help reduce flea beetles.
Mhm.
But we still see, again, we still see these huge populations that can easily overwhelm the field. So
Yeah.
I wish there was more cultural things we could do, but at this
Mhm.
moment we don't have them. More research is needed.
We need to find a use for flea beetles. I mean, sort of like an industrial use, because once you try to grow the things, they'll all of a sudden be difficult to grow. It's
That's
worked every
right.
time.
Yeah. That's, in research too, we always have a joke that good way to get rid of insects is to give us a funded project, because then they're hard to find. So
I think that occurred with the, I'm thinking the canola mycoplasma disease.
Oh, aster yellows.
Yeah, aster yellows, because we had 1 year in my entire career, I remember we had fairly high levels of damage and incidents. And so they funded research, and the next year went back to the basement level.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about, let's see, what other insects? Let's talk about berthas. They're such a, well, they're one of those bertha armyworms. They kind of show up occasionally. They tend to be hot spotters, I find, because I've been to places where one guy's got huge numbers. Started in the middle of his field. By the time he figured out what was going on, he probably lost half his crop. A mile away, his neighbor had canola, and I had a hard time finding the bertha armyworm. That's how specific they are.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good one. They are, although we consider them a canola pest, they are still a bit of a generalist. They'll feed on a variety of things. Similar to what you just mentioned, I've been in a quinoa field, and then across from that was a canola field, and the quinoa was just dripping with bertha, and there was nothing in the canola. So they do, and people have said, they seem to have a preference for lamb's quarters. They'll feed on that, and then once they've finished that, they'll move on to the next thing. So yeah, and they are, of course, a native species, and we do see this cyclical cycle in a lot of different regions, usually thought to be about a 7 or 8 year cycle. And currently at the moment, it seems like we're at the low end throughout most of Alberta. I believe I heard of some spraying for bertha in a couple fields in central Alberta last year, but that was it. And the Peace region seems to be kind of on the down end of a bertha cycle. So
that's good news.
Yeah. So they're an interesting critter, but we do have quite a few natural enemies against them. There are there's a big parasitoid wasp, as well as actually some parasitoid flies that will parasitize the larvae. And so that's what really helps to drive the cycles that we see. So.
And once again, it also depends on when they're peaking with the stage of the crop. And that's one area I found over the years. You almost got a convergence of increasing damage as the crop matures. And then the third factor coming in, of course, is the pre-harvest interval of using an insecticide.
Yes.
And when should you spray? Once again, and we use numbers on this one, but it's, it sounds hard and fast, but it's still, there's a lot of gray area in there as to the decision when to pull the trigger.
Yes.
And once again, I have a problem with a lot of our insecticides. It's that they're so general, they just kill everything.
Yes. Yeah, we do have, some of those kind of quote unquote softer insecticides available. Yeah. They're also the more expensive ones, but but yeah, that can be an issue. It also, of course, depends on the price of everything too, right? The price of the crop. And we had that a lot this summer with other insects. Is should I spray to, save a bushel an acre when my crop is going to be very poor as it is? So yeah, it's unfortunately never a hard and fast rule, but
yeah. And then, of course, the last time I can remember there was major damage due from diamondback moth, and was back in 2005, which is a while ago.
Yeah.
But that summer, we had quite a lot of winds from the southeast, which is often a very common springtime activity, and it brought up a lot. But there was quite a few acres that did get sprayed because the numbers were just so massive.
Yes.
Can't remember any major areas being sprayed since then.
Yeah, not in Alberta. Other parts of the prairies, I think it was 2017 in Saskatchewan when I was there.
Okay.
There were some fields in more south of Saskatoon that were being sprayed for diamondback. Last summer in Manitoba, in their Interlake region, there was quite a few fields that were sprayed for diamondback moth. But yeah, those wind currents that you talk about, they're monitored every year by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada scientists. And they put out kind of weekly updates on the wind trajectories, and it seems to hold well for Saskatchewan and Manitoba and diamondback, but Alberta, maybe it's the closeness of the Rockies and slight changes in wind trajectories or something. It doesn't seem to work as well as kind of trying to predict our populations here.
So these guys are coming up without their passports from the US, right? So where did they overwinter?
So southern US, northern Mexico, they can survive down there, kind of Texas, Southern California, Arizona, that region, all, where the snowbirds like to go. So, and then and I guess one of the questions is, is it kind of a northward expansion each spring and they just kind of hop along, or is it, populations we get here are those that are originally from Texas, or are they kind of slowly moving up with temperatures and growing conditions? So that's something that we still need to work on. And actually, we have a project coming up to look at that. So, we probably won't find any diamondback. But we're trying to use actually genetics to try and look at our populations here and how closely related they are to populations in areas in the United States and Mexico, to see if those wind trajectories are holding true for what we do find here. And one thing we tend to worry about with diamondback, and we should worry about with diamondback, is insecticide resistance.
Yes.
Diamondback moth worldwide, of course, it's a huge pest worldwide, and it's developed resistance across the world. Not every single population, but across the world, populations have developed resistance to basically every single class of insecticide or group of insecticide that we have.
That's not good news.
No. So luckily, when we do tend to have outbreaks here in Canada, so far, we've had successful control with our, standard products. But that is something we do need to keep an eye on, is if we do get these big outbreaks of diamondback, and if we do get control failures, is that, something to do with application, or is it actually the populations might be resistant to these insecticides? So the populations in the southern US, they do have resistance to some groups, but not all. So we do still have tools available to control them.
So how long is the lifespan of a diamondback? Like, how long is the life cycle?
That's a great question. So under the right growing conditions here on the prairies, there can be 4 generations in a summer.
4.
And so that's why our current monitoring we're using pheromone traps for diamondback. We put them out early, right? Like half the time once we seed, basically. And then because it's thought that the earlier diamondback moth arrives here on the prairies, the higher the likelihood that could lead to large populations. Right. Because then we can get more and more generations produced that summer, of course, increasing the population number and leading to more damage. So that's why we start monitoring for it early in the year. And we generally stop monitoring for it kind of by the 1st of July, because we think, any of those late arriving individuals after that, their populations won't get, or hopefully don't get that large.
Yeah. I think a lot of we've been very fortunate, I think, because we do have some of the predators that.
Yes. And that's, there has been a lot of work by my predecessor, the late Lloyd Dosdell at the U of A, who found, there's multiple parasitoid wasps, over a dozen parasitoid wasps that will attack diamondback moth. Yeah. Some of them, they're more generalist. They'll attack other caterpillars, but some are also specialists. There's actually a parasitoid that often arrives with the diamondback moth. So it comes up on these winds as well.
Mm-hmm.
A Diadagma insularia is the name of it, and it helps to control those populations. So, and that's one, diamondback moth, if we do have heavy rainfalls, or that can wash them off the plant, they can drown. There can be fungal pathogens that help to kill them off on the plant. So there are quite a few kind of more natural ways to that will help kill them off in our crops.
They're kind of our heartwarming little buddies that are doing our work in the field for us. Thanks, guys. Keep up the good work. Well, let's talk about, I know cabbage seedpod weevil is not yet in our county, but I mean, in certain areas, it's devastating if you don't treat it properly. Now, I find it interesting with them, once again, the cabbage seedpod weevil is a good flyer.
Yes.
So if you're first off the bat to get your canola in, guess what?
Yep. And it has been, I believe, found at least at times as far north as Edmonton or just south of Edmonton.
Okay.
Not in huge populations causing economic damage, but there has been cabbage seedpod weevil found.
Yeah.
So it can expand northward and does, but then we do see it kind of contract, especially if you look at some of the historical maps available from the Prairie Pest Monitoring Network and their yearly surveys. It has often, gone up almost to red deer and then can contract down just based off its populations. But
you know why? Like what limits its northern range? Because I mean, if we're in a period of increasing temperatures and hotter summers, the possibility exists that we're going to see a lot of these pests moving up.
Yeah. And so, but what's causing it to contract?
Yeah.
I don't think we really know. It could be a combination of our overwintering conditions with potential. There's not a whole lot of biological control agents or natural enemies, or at least specialists on cabbage seedpod weevil, but it could be some natural enemies helping as well. Yeah, that is one that we are consistently worried about, this northward expansion. If we're talking about another crop and we're talking about something that used to be considered a southern Alberta pest, we could think of pea leaf weevil and peas.
Right.
It used to be kind of considered a pest south of Highway 1.
Yeah, don't worry about it.
Yeah, now it's best established in the province pretty much is around Edmonton. And so, but we're not really sure what's the case with cabbage seedpod weevil. Why hasn't it successfully established in some of these more northern regions? Not sure what's going on there. But as you mentioned, like that is one almost yearly, those canola crops in southern Alberta, first to flower, the weevils are really attracted to the yellow color. Yeah. And so we often see those fields being sprayed with insecticide. But as more and more fields start to flower, we get this dilution effect, and there's usually less insecticide sprayed in those later flowering fields. So Hector Carcamo, I know, a research scientist at Ag Canada in Lethbridge in the past, he's done some work with trap cropping to see if if you had an earlier flowering crop around the outside than the main crop, can you attract and concentrate weevils, and then just, if you have to, spray them within that trap crop. So there are some kind of interesting kind of alternative or trying to be a little bit more sustainable tactics that are being looked into, but inevitably there's fields sprayed every year for cabbage seedpod weevil.
Always nice to know that the retailers are making their sales. I shouldn't be like that. Let's talk about something we got no control over at all. Crucifer root maggots. I found them to be interesting because they used to be a real problem on Polish canola. That just tells you how old I am. And oftentimes you'll see a lot of damage on the roots of some of the Argentine varieties that we commonly use now. We don't seem to have a good handle on modern damage levels, or is there anything we can do about them?
Yeah, that's kind of one we've just relegated to. We can't do much, unfortunately. And it wasn't they seem to have kind of, I guess, dropped off the radar for most people, right? They used to be, everyone was worried about them. Now you might see kind of a wilty looking plant in the field. Maybe you'll pull it up, find a few maggots, and well, it was one plant. What can you do?
And it could be disease as well.
Exactly.
Nothing exists in isolation, right?
Mm-hmm. I was talking to Steven Stelkov at the U of A here, our plant pathologist with club roots, and wondering about, okay, with the incidence of club root, now we have these really nice, massive galls on the roots. Or is that also associated with more of the root maggot damage? But we haven't really found that we're seeing any more incidents of root maggot, even though we see these huge galls on the plant. But yeah, that's one, there used to be some products available as seed treatments, I believe, to control. Those are no longer there.
I don't think they worked all that good either.
Yeah. And I think it was an area kind of east of Edmonton, more towards Vermilion, that used to be the worst off area in the province for root maggots. And I don't know if it's a change in genetics. Some of these newer cultivars or varieties are just, more vigorous and can withstand extra feeding pressure on the roots, or what's happening there. But it's one that's really kind of dropped off the radar.
They're sort of there, but no one's really got a good handle on if or how much it actually affects yield, which ultimately is what most producers are concerned about.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about your friend and mine, the grasshopper.
I guess this past summer being so hot and dry, that was a big one everyone was worried about.
Yep.
I would say, of course, I think it was one we should be worried about. But it didn't pan out as bad as we thought it was going to be. There were areas in southern Alberta and areas kind of more north that had some heavy grasshopper populations, but central Alberta, and maybe you can correct me, there wasn't as many as we would have thought, especially given the hot and dry conditions we had.
I'm concerned about next year because we had such a good fall for them to lay eggs, right?
Yes.
There was that nice and dry. There was very little death due to fungus on them. And I did notice that the numbers were increasing. Like when we did the survey in 2020, it was hard to find grasshoppers anywhere. Last year, we were starting to see them. They were hopping around, but there wasn't enough to really cause a lot of damage. Yet, under drought conditions, they seem to really proliferate. They love it when it's hot. And I think the potential is for some problems this year, because usually drought conditions is a combination, poor growth, so they move off the pastures and the undisturbed areas early, get onto the crops and cause more damage.
Yeah, and I would agree completely with you. I think next year is where we have to start worrying even more so, especially if we have these warm, hot, dry conditions persist. Of course, our crops are going to be not in great shape to begin with, and then we might have increased grasshopper pressure. I guess the one thing, canola, grasshoppers aren't usually considered a huge pest in canola. It's usually our cereals that they go for before they do, but they will feed on canola. It's not that they don't, they will. But they're usually considered less of a pest in canola compared to some of our other field crops.
It's not the preferred feeding.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes.
But they will, especially, if there's not a lot available and it's green and juicy still, they will definitely feed on it.
Yeah.
So.
This is a little off the topic, but I'm curious. With zero tillage and grasshoppers, do you start seeing more grasshopper outbreaks in the middle of a field than coming from the edges?
Oof. That's a good question. I don't know if anyone's looked into that.
Because I'm just wondering, because it's, normally they don't like to lay their eggs in disturbed soils. But if you're zero tilling, then you've got it undisturbed. And I'm wondering if there was the potential sometime down the road that then they're able to lay eggs throughout the whole field. And there have been cases too where I remember years ago around Paradise Valley where the outbreak occurred in the middle of a field, south-facing slope, because of course that's where the eggs would have been distributed first, but that was a crop field. And I was just curious about it.
Yeah. I don't know.
Well, that's the beauty of it. There's so many questions that need to still be answered that we haven't got a good answer for. It obviously means that you're going to be working till you're 80 just to answer them, or at least answer just a few of them.
Yes.
Your future is set for the... Is there any other important insects we've maybe not covered?
I don't know. Well, something on to put on the radar is a species called the canola flower midge.
Oh, right, those little guys.
So that one, we described that species just a few years ago. It was the one that was a mistaken identity. We used to think it was actually Swede midge, which is an absolutely devastating pest in Eastern Canada, but thankfully not here. The canola flower midge, I have a graduate student working on a project in your county around Galahad and Forestburg. So we do see populations throughout your county. Some fields, it's like finding a needle in a haystack looking for damaged. And so they just create flower, basically cause a gall on the flower so the flower doesn't open and you won't get a pod. But, it's something just to keep an eye on. We haven't seen what we would consider economic damage throughout the county, but it is there. And so if people are seeing kind of these misshapen flowers, you can always pop them open. And if there are small little white to yellow maggots inside, that's going to be the canola flower midge. Just something to keep an eye on.
I'm just thinking it's kind of like the field of dreams. If you build it, they will come. If you keep growing it, we'll get some new ones.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we've done work in the past in Saskatchewan that we had a few canola fields, and populations were definitely higher within those fields. So it does go to show, crop rotation is key for a lot of our insects and a lot of our insect pests. So,
sometimes our fathers and grandfathers weren't too dumb when they were farming without all the inputs. Mind you, they weren't getting paid $24 a bushel for canola either. It's a huge driver.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for this time and for your knowledge and information. If somebody wants to get a hold of you for some more information, how would they go about it? Just email?
Yeah, absolutely. Email is probably the best way. I'm also on Twitter, just Boyd Mori on Twitter. But I'm usually only more active on that in the summertime. So I guess that's always another way to reach out. But
what's your email address?
It's just bmori, MORI, and then U, like the letter, alberta.ca.
Thank you so much for this. This has been wonderful.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.